this episode, we're going to be continuing our playlist looking at the Quake testimonies. We've looked at simplicity and truth already, and in this episode, we're going to be looking at equality. And I think I have to say, when I was prepping for this video, it's like there's a lot to say about equality. When I went in, I kind of thought, oh yeah, it'd be the same amount as truth and simplicity. But no, I've got lots to say about equality, and I think it's because, as I mentioned in a previous video, simplicity and truth start with the individual, I suppose, and then has an outward effect. Whereas the next two, equality and peace, require a community. You know, having equality and having peace can only work in a community of people. So, and I think because of that, there is more to say. But I would even argue, especially at the moment, I don't know. I kind of feel that there's more to say about equality, maybe even than peace right now, which is, well, we'll see. We'll see. That's what I'm just thinking at this initial outset. So, like with all of the other, the other two that I've done, we're going to be looking at the history of how Quakers have understood equality, how it's developed over time, and some helpful tips to help you be more Quaker and more equal in today's world. So, as you might be getting maybe tired of me saying, the reasons why these testimonies are also very good is because they go right to the very heart of what the early Quakers were trying to do. Looking at equality, and in terms of certainly where the Quakers were coming in terms of the Reformation or the repercussions, shall we say, of the Reformation from the previous century, the development of the idea of the priesthood of all believers became very important. Now, originally this started out in the original Reformation, shall we say, in the 1500s, as a way of taking the priestly class off the pedestal that had been given by the Catholic Church and making them more human, I suppose, and less that intermediary figure between the laity and the divine. So a lot of the denominations that came out of the Reformation, for example, got rid of bishops, for example, and certainly the supernatural element of the priestly class was diminished amongst many, not all, but a lot of reformist denominations. But this wasn't the case in the Anglican Church, as understood just within the English Civil War period, so the period where Quakerism took off, which had a very strict hierarchy. You know, you had the king at the top as head of the church, you had archbishops, you had bishops, and you had priests. And the priests and the bishops and the archbishops were all men, and men of station as well. You know, these weren't just, some rugged Yorkshiremen. These were educated people from Oxford and Cambridge, who'd been educated in how to be a priest, so a very, very hierarchical version of church life. So, as we have seen by now, these testimonies that we're talking about got the early Quakers in a lot of trouble. I would say equality probably got them in the most trouble socially, and the reason for that is this: that they took that concept of the priesthood of all believers to its utmost extreme. They linked it with the growing idea of that of God in everyone, and the idea that everyone could minister. So it wasn't just one priest leading the sermon, that everyone could lead the sermon, and everyone included women. Now, at this point, I don't believe there were any denominations, I'm happy to be wrong on that, that had women in a sort of ministerial role. Obviously, in the church, there had been many, many, many women saints, but to have that ministerial role, I don't think there are any. As said, happy to be wrong. And this was something that Quakers were insistent on when it came to this idea of the priesthood of all believers, that of God in everyone really was in everyone. And because it was in everyone, everyone has that relationship with the inward light, and so therefore could minister. And if you look at a lot of the early Quakers, they were women. A lot of them were women. I've talked before in other videos about Mary Dyer, who was hanged in Boston for trying to be a Quaker preaching. I've talked about Mary Fisher as well, who was lots of Marys, who famously and outrageously and brilliantly took Quakerism to the heart of the Ottoman Empire and spoke with the Sultan there. But I think probably the main Quaker woman certainly in the early period has to be Margaret Fell, and because of her state, so she was a noblewoman, so she was literate, and eventually she married George Fox, and so she had a very prominent start in the early Quakers. Swarthmore Hall was her home, which was the sort of the hub of Quakerism before it moved to London, and even still today, Swarthmore Hall is still a very important sort of meeting place for friends. Sorry if you can hear any rustling. That's because one of my cats has discovered the wrapping paper underneath the sofa and is very interested by it. So Margaret Fell even wrote a pamphlet on women preaching and why it was good that they did this, and why it was right that they did this, and why women should preach, because obviously that got a huge backlash that these female preachers were coming around, and in a world where that was, I think in modern day society we can't even begin to imagine the misogyny of that time. I think I'm not saying that there isn't misogyny nowadays, but I think how entrenched it was and how just open it was. I have huge respect for these women that did these things. Also links, as they all do, with other testimonies. So, for example, if you're being equal, you're not going to use honorifics or titles. You're not going to use the fancy schmancy word for you. You're going to use the down-to-earth, folksy thou and thee. Not just because it's truthful or simple, but because it's also equal. Just making too much noise. So, moving on into the 18th century, I think probably what Quakers are most known for in terms of the testimony to simplicity was the fight for the abolition of slavery. Now, I want to stress, and I think I have stressed this in other videos, but I really do want to stress that Quakers weren't always against slavery. There are many Quakers who had slaves. Quakers in Britain today are doing a lot of work looking at reparations to make right that wrong that they did. We've talked about John Woolman before and what he did and his understandings of that. So I don't want to rehash that again, but I think someone to really bear in mind when it comes to the Quaker understanding of equality when it came to the abolition of slavery. Another person to really highlight in that is Lucretia Mott. So she was more 19th century. So whereas John Woolman was 18th century, but she did a lot of things. So she actively supported the Underground Railway, for example. She founded the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. She was a delegate for the World Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840, and she was a really big protester as well with her husband, with protesting against the Fugitive Slave Act, which was one of the precursors to the American Civil War. But the idea that if a slave had escaped to a non-slave state, or as in a state where where slavery was not legal, then they were obligated to give the slave back to their owners, and so she campaigned very vehemently against that. This obviously then led to Quakers being very predominant when it came to the civil rights movement. I talked about Bayard Rustin in my Truth video. He was a black LGBTQ Quaker who campaigned alongside Martin Luther King during the civil rights movement. In the 20th and 21st centuries, so the more modern way that, I'm not saying that all the others aren't important anymore, but I think like the new sort of understandings of how equality has changed in a way that maybe wasn't considered too much in the past, is looking at upholding the LGBTQ plus community. So obviously this started mainly with the right for same-sex marriage. So Quakers, at least in Britain, became the first religious organization to allow same-sex marriage, because Quakers have, which I think have I gone into, or I will do, have slightly different marriage laws or marriage exemptions. So they were able to do it when the Church of England, for example, still is not. So that was in 2009 when that was accepted. So the first Quaker weddings of same-sex couples took place, and so this was way before the government allowed same-sex marriages, which I think was in 2015. So way ahead of the trend there. And again, that's not to say that this hasn't caused friction in any way. There were yearly meetings, especially in America, which split over the issue of same-sex marriage. As I said, I'm not saying that that it hasn't always been the case, but I'm saying that in terms of what's more at the fore, maybe I think is also, as well as looking to include people of different ethnic backgrounds and supporting gay marriage and things like that, but also now looking to support the trans community, which I think, at least for me, it feels that this has become way more of a topic in the popular imagination than maybe it was even maybe 10 years ago. And yet again, this is causing people to discuss this within the society, and I think ultimately my view is that looking at equality, and especially looking at the long Quaker tradition of upholding people who are suffering, I think this is something that is really important right now, because there are people who are suffering with these discrimination and with their mental health with that as well, because society isn't necessarily always welcoming of people of the LGBT, especially of the trans community right now. And I think being a space where that suffering and that hurt can be listened to and respected is really important, and something that Quakers can offer. So looking at some tips then, what can we do to be more equal? Obviously, as I said, we can't be equal with ourselves, so we have to be equal with others. And how can we do that? As I kind of am doing in quite a lot of these, I would recommend taking your thoughts about equality to meeting, or just contemplating and reflecting on that, looking at the world today, and looking at where inequality lies and what you can do about it, what the inner light might be calling you to do, and educating yourself as well, maybe on historical inequalities as well, and how they still permeate in today's world. Mark Russ, for example, I think he's doing his PhD in looking at whiteness in Quakerism, and looking at how he did mention this in his last video. He does mention it in his new book as well, which I am very excited to have just received. So we'll be looking at that as well. But looking at like unperceived bias and unperceived privileges that white people have had, maybe without even realizing it, and recognizing the discrepancy there. I think if you are so led, then I think that this is certainly something to take social action on. It was really nice when I was speaking to Imi about that, and she mentioned how supported she felt when talking about going to protests, and how supportive other Quakers were to help them, the younger Quakers, do that safely, so that their voices could be heard, but they felt safe in doing that. And so I certainly wouldn't recommend, if you've never been to a protest, to go by yourself necessarily. I would always go with someone. And if you are feeling led to do that, then that is something that you should do if it's to uphold the testimony of equality. And I think probably my last bit of tip as to be more Quaker and equal is looking to create safer spaces for those people who are marginalized. So, and thinking collaboratively, imaginatively in your community, in your meeting, in your day-to-day, how you can be a place which is inclusive, how you yourself can be an ally to these people, and uphold them in supporting them in today's society. And have sessions where people can talk about their experiences, maybe talk about what they would like to see, reach out to them, see how they think the community can be better, and work with them in order to promote, as I said, a more harmonious community in today's world. I think on that, if you want to get involved with the idea of reparations coming from Quakers in Britain, then I can put a link on underneath talking about how you might be able to do that, or what Quakers are doing. And if you want to get involved, or if you have ideas, then obviously then it's all good. I think what's fundamentally important with what Quakers are trying to do is not even necessarily understand. I think understanding is obviously great, but I think it's that integral respect the other, of everyone in humanity, that I think Quakers need to uphold, and that they believe that there's that of God in everyone, that everyone has this worth, that everyone is worth listening to, that everyone could be speaking the words of the divine without you necessarily knowing it. And I think that initial respect is something that we as Quakers need to be upholding. Oh, and another thing, obviously, about when it comes, I suppose I sort of mentioned it as well earlier. When it comes to Quaker equality, there's no hierarchical system in terms of how Quakers are led. So, as I said, in your meeting, everyone can minister. Anyone can take part in area meeting. Anyone can take part in yearly meeting. You know, there's participation on all levels. So it's not like you can only go this far because you're an attender. You can only go this far because you're just a lowly regular friend. But if you are like, you know, arch friend, then you can go here and you can take part in these discussions. It's completely equal. So there you go. That is a brief introduction to the Quaker testimony of equality, going from looking at the priesthood of all believers and especially promoting women's ministry, understanding that of God led people to believe that slavery was wrong and campaigning against slavery and racism, and in today's society looking at supporting members of the LGBTQ plus community and giving them a safe and welcoming space. And I'm sure that's something that Friends will continue to do, because I think ultimately it's defending the marginalized and upholding them and giving them a safe space. So the last video will be on peace, which will be which I'm very excited about doing, but also quite nervous about doing it because it is a very, very big topic. But we'll see how we go. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you when that next video comes up.
Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.